It means to right now, I'm joined by Mr. James Mboleo, an international relations expert who will be telling us the reason Rwanda is actually doing this. Yes, they want to set the pace in the East Africa region. They've been one of the cleanest countries. Actually, they're still one of the cleanest countries in the world. And trust me, they are really also tightening their biodegradable laws and so many things actually happening in that country. Welcome, Mr. James, in studio.
Thank you.
All right. Now, when you talk about Rwanda, when you hear Rwanda, in the back of your mind, the first thing will come is just beauty. Yes, in so many ways.
Yes, and that is very interesting because for the longest time, Rwanda was associated with one of the worst things in the world.
Absolutely, sure.
In 1994, the genocide created in the conscience of humankind the biggest stain of killing of several millions of people. And you know, Rwanda doesn't have a big population. However, after that, Rwanda has now started setting the pace in a lot of things. Rwanda is one of the easiest places to do business, for instance, in East Africa. It used to be a francophone country. It has now changed into an anglophone country. It has joined the East African community. You know, initially, the East African community was Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And it's true that Rwanda is one of the cleanest places now, not just in East Africa, but across the continent.
Yeah, sure.
So Rwanda Rwanda's cabinet adopted a policy to eliminate or to prohibit the use of what we call single-use plastics. The examples that come to mind immediately of single-use plastics are things like straws, the bottles for soda and water in Kenya and so on, plastic tumblers, plastic plates, and so on and so forth. So when something like that happens, of course, there are socio-economic and political implications to be had.
Absolutely. Now, when you mention about social and, of course, economic, political, and all those implications, let's focus on the manufacturers, the importers, and even some exporters in this point. Yes, Kenya, we kind of adopted a ban on polythene bags.
Yes.
Yeah, it took control. Yes, slowly, it kind of, the laws were very tight. People feared. Now, it's been scrapped completely. Now, the economic implications, because we have relations whereby now the people who've been importing these products, the people who've also been exporting such products. Now, for the local industries who've been making these products, how will they feel the pinch? Because already, is there maybe alternative for that? Are they prepared to face this?
It's good to start by saying that, you know, the move towards ban of single-use plastics is not just Rwanda's. The East African Community Head Summit, which happened in Arusha just the other day, attended by His Excellency the President Uhuru Kenyatta, had intended to pass a law in the East African community which would ensure the use of single-use plastics was actually banned across East Africa. It didn't happen, but Rwanda was preparing towards that particular point. And you know that Rwanda is now the chair of the East African community. Now, back home in Kenya, the environment in Kenya is managed under the National Environmental Management Act, which creates what we call NEMA, the National Environment Management Authority. And so, economically speaking, of course, there's going to be an impact in the ban of single-use plastics, because manufacturers have to then rethink how they are going to bottle, you know, some of the products they manufacture. Some of these people, especially involved in industries like food industries, are going to have to seriously rethink how they are going to pass off their products to the consumer. Now, when such thing happens, of course, it affects a whole supply chain. There are people who depend on these industries for their livelihood. Of course, there are manufacturers of those plastics who then supply the final consumers on these plastics, and they're going to definitely get out of business. This definitely then means that even people who work in those industries are also going to be affected. So when a policy like this is implemented, of course, as I said, there needs to be fairly good notice on the people involved in that industry, so that they can be aware that by a certain point in time, we are no longer going to be allowed to bring in these plastics or to use them for manufacturing or to use them as consumers. There is a cost implication involved, because eventually, probably if straws made of plastic were the in thing and they're cheaper, then somebody has to find a solution which is equivalent either in terms of price or in terms of manufacturing for purposes of replacing those single-use plastics.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'm sure any action, for example, from Rwanda affects even other countries, neighboring countries especially. Now, how will they feel the pinch in this situation, the neighbors?
The neighbors, especially Kenya, are definitely going to feel the pinch. It is worth to note that, you know, the Kenyan economy is one of the largest in the region. And Rwanda, Uganda especially, are some of our key trading partners. So the products we make in Kenya, both in the agricultural sector and in other sectors, let's say for instance the plastic sector, finally find their way into countries like Uganda and Rwanda. And so a ban in plastics in Rwanda definitely means something for some manufacturers who have been depending on the Rwandan market as a market destination for their products. But most importantly also, you must note that it's not just manufacturers. These products are also used by consumers. One of the common products you see around is the plastic plates that is used in parties. You've seen tumblers and so on, plastic spoons, plastic forks in fast food restaurants and so on. So when you ban those products, then it means that you have just reduced the market size for the manufacturers who make those products.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, the heads of state, for example, now Rwanda is just a new entrant into the EAC. We expect so much exchange programs coming in from these neighboring countries. What might be the repercussion in terms of now when they sit on that decision-making situation? Do you think there'll be some questions? Do you think... I understand that as a country, they have the liberty to do anything they want. But do you think there'll be questions posed to maybe the potential EAC chairman, Mr. Paul Kagame? I
do not think. I think on the contrary, in actual fact, Rwanda should be lauded for making steps towards a cleaner environment, because it is good eventually for all, even including for manufacturers. The important thing you must realize about international decision making is it takes care of the fact that ultimately countries which are sovereigns are going to have to make independent decisions. There are things which countries are forced to do because the international sphere requires them. For instance, the migration into digital space. You know, for a very long time we had analog TVs. Absolutely. And then the international regulator said, we are no longer going to play in that space anymore. We are going to have to move to digital platform. And for a very long time, some countries had to resist it because their media stations were resisting. But at some point, they had to give in and say, hey, we have to finally migrate. Sure. So Kenya is one of those countries that was affected. So some of these things do not necessarily, are not resisted just because countries want to resist them. It's because they affect certain business interests, for instance, which will push very hard to make sure these things don't happen. But on the other hand, you also must realize that, for instance, when you have a regional bloc like the East African community, decision making, it can't be homogeneous and uniform in most times, because each country has a mind of its own. And each country may not be ready to do the things that other countries are doing, even within the regional bloc. And that's why, even within the East African community, we have something we call the principle of subsidiarity or complementarity. We give room for certain countries which think that their system probably hasn't grown to a certain level at which they can implement certain things to be able to get there, so that they can operate within optimal environment with the rest of the members of the East African community. So I think what Rwanda has done is a good thing. And ultimately, I am sure that these other countries are going to follow suit. And I see that in the East African community, Kenya and Uganda are likely to follow suit faster because when you observe the historical decision-making processes and the kind of relationships that the East African community countries have had, you tend to see that Kenya, Uganda and Rwanda seem to be agreeing faster on certain things than with their counterpart Tanzania and Burundi on the other side. So I expect that in not so long, Kenya is probably also going to have to think about possibly going that route. Yes.
That was my next question, actually. Should people brace for such changes? Because now, once a neighbor decides this is actually like something that can be executed, that means there must be some fear also in these other plastic manufacturing countries. Now, should someone somewhere, a business-oriented mind, think about alternatives already?
Absolutely. You see, this is both a good and bad thing. Now, for the people who have already established manufacturing structures, distribution mechanisms for the use of plastics and so on, this comes as a negative impact on their business. Okay. This comes as bad news for their business. But then on the other hand, there are the entrepreneurs, the opportunists, who see this as an ultimate opportunity to invest in. Sure. Because once you pull out the role played by plastics in that space, then somebody else is going to have to fill that space with something. And so other businesses are definitely going to mushroom for purposes of taking over that space. Let me give you a very good example. And this is what all manufacturers and people who play in that space are supposed to be doing. For a very long time, Bata, our local leather shoes company in Kenya, could not live up with the competition posed by other importers of shoes and so on. And so at some point they had to make a decision. Do we continue operating in that old space and get out of business? The answer is no. So they started also going out to bring the same shoes that other players were bringing in. And having been in that business for much longer, with a good distribution network, with a known name, all of a sudden, Bata is now booming. Of course, not necessarily only with the shoes that they make locally, but even with other products from other countries. Another good example is Everready. Everready for the longest time was suffering because it could hardly manage even its own costs in the production of batteries and so on and so forth. Then all of a sudden somebody told them, hey, you don't have to worry too much. You can also go to China just like everybody else and bring those batteries. But in this case, make sure you bring better batteries than the bad batteries that are coming from China that are in the market. And right now, Everready, I can assure you, is playing in that space much more better than these other players because it had the distribution networks, it had been in this business for long. So just like manufacturers, I don't expect anyone to go out of business just because there has been a shift in policy for or against the use of plastics. I expect that a good entrepreneur, a good investor should quickly see this as an opportunity, and because there's going to be some time for them to phase out, then to get into that space where the country is moving into.
Finally, I understand it's a free society, and must tough laws be implemented for such effects to happen? Because now, when you see in Kenya, polythene bags, tough laws were actually implemented just to see these things actually being scrapped off from our society. Now, for example, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, let's just focus on these three countries first. Rwanda has set the pace. Do you think now that will spill over to countries like Uganda? They still use polythene bags, Tanzania still use them, but now Kenya and Rwanda, yes, they're setting the best, but the spillover effect, do you think maybe soon we'll be finding out?
First, I need to say something. I watched a documentary a couple of months back in which the Director General of the National Environmental Management Authority was giving an interview saying that the implementation of the ban on plastics in this country has been fairly good, and that in spite of a few cases, you can say that wholesomely the ban has went on very well. But then he said something that, you know, at our border points, let's say for instance at the border point between Kenya and Uganda, there are still traders who bring in plastics from Uganda and so on. And then thereafter, his counterpart in Uganda made the same statement and said that it is actually from Kenya that these things are sourced, and so on and so forth. So what am I trying to say here? You know, something like ripping off a culture of plastics from the space of the market is not supposed to be easy. And I don't think we are going to promise ourselves that this is something that can be easy. The role of law is to give authorities like the police and the National Management Authority that ultimate power to prohibit some of these things. And when it is implemented, it is implemented in the toughest sense, because if you do not, then you are not going to be able to bring this country into a plane in which they no longer use plastics. Even now, in some markets, if you go, you can find a little plastic here and there, which means the ban has not achieved 100% compliance. But with time, of course, I expect that the National Management Authority and the other agencies will acquire or achieve 100% compliance.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. James, for coming to the studio. We really appreciate your sentiments. But of course, we hope to see you soon again, talk matters East Africa, because, you know, international relations is something you can touch on so many aspects.
You're welcome.
As you're aware, Nkurunziza and Kagame, there's still some tension.
Absolutely.
So we'll also be talking about those developments soon. So I hope to see you again.
Thank you.